you can state that in absolute terms there is only one truth, and that is the only acceptable truth.
Well, I don't state that. Jesus claimed that.
Right, okay.
Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me, and I'm just the mailman. I didn't make this stuff up.
Do you think that there might be some foundation to the claims that there are biological reasons why we have certain rules that within society are reasonable and therefore worth carrying out?
I would say that your reason, as a very educated Westerner, leads you to conclude rationally that certain behaviors are superior to others, but I hope that you would not tell Eskimos that when they put their babies out to freeze in the snow, that would be wrong. I hope you wouldn't lay your cultural bias with your heavy emphasis on reason in this culture on some Eskimo who's got his own reasons for putting his baby out to freeze in the snow.
Do you think that there are any situations in which anthropological reasons for certain activities of societies that we deem to be unusual or unorthodox or even sinful might have reasonable explanations given the histories of those cultures? For example, your Eskimo example.
Yeah, I think Adolf Hitler had a reason for gassing Jews. He was convinced that Jews were a lower level of the evolutionary cycle. He was convinced that Jews drained Nazi Germany of valuable financial resources, and therefore he wanted to liquidate Jews. He had his reasons. He was very reasonable. I think he was absolutely wrong. Evil.
Do you think he was being logical, though?
Yes, absolutely logical.
In what way do you think his conclusion that Jews were an inferior species is a logical assertion?
Because from his observation, he concluded that the Aryan race was better, superior, and he, from his experience, concluded that Jews drained Germany of a lot of its nationalism, and that therefore it led to a lot of suffering in Germany. And he was convinced if he could just pump up the German people, the Aryan race, that the economic train would get back on track, and it sure began to.
Do you think he honestly had sufficient scientific reasoning and evidence behind that conclusion?
Obviously, for himself, he sure did.
Well, that certainly supposes a relativistic, term to what
exactly.
He did.
And if there is no God, Hitler's right for himself, you're right for yourself, I'm right for myself, it's all relative.
Do you think that science is only a relative process?
George Bernard Shaw, quote, "The science to which I pinned my faith is bankrupt. Its counsels, which should have established the millennium, led instead directly to the suicide of Europe. I believed them once. In their name, I helped destroy the faith of millions of worshippers in the temples of 1,000 creeds. And now they look at me and witness the great tragedy of an atheist who has lost his faith." I respect George Bernard Shaw highly. He had his faith in science. Then he saw the most highly scientific nation of the world, Nazi Germany, destroy people in Europe, right and left. And George Bernard Shaw had the intellectual honesty and the courage and the humility to say, my faith in science is bankrupt. You put your faith in science, obviously you've not answered the question, ethically, how do you use science? To destroy life or to promote life?
Is it fair to say philosophically that in the same way theologians can admit at later points, once scientific discoveries have been made, that their interpretations of what was actually going on in Scripture were wrong, that scientists can indeed say that also their interpretation of the science was wrong?
It's impossible, based on science, to build an ethic. Science is a study of process, how things happen. You cannot base justice, love, forgiveness on science. It's a totally different field of knowledge.
Is it possible to build a basis of belief and morality upon logic?
Logic? Sure, you can build an ethical system on logic.
Okay.
But not on science. On logic, sure.
The foundation of science is, in theory, logic. It can be said that science can be flawed. For example, I would cite your example of Nazi Germany, where eugenics as a science is essentially flawed. It has no real foundation. They thought it to be true at the time, but I think that you could have at least found scientists in that time period that said that they were absolutely wrong, and thus their conclusion that by weeding out Jews and gypsies, that they would improve their species to be terribly flawed. And so it's possible to say that the primary loss then of Nazi Germany was that they made a decision that was entirely illogical, that they made a decision based upon hate, upon racial discrimination and bias, and not upon real fact.
Yeah, but sir, science doesn't tell us anything about love and hate. Science is a study of process, how the physical world operates. When you get into good and evil, you're talking philosophy and theology, which is a different form of knowledge.
I do agree with that, but I think you can explain feelings at least in some way with chemistry.
Sure. Endorphins, chemical balance or imbalance in the brain affects our feelings.
And it's possible to explain the evolution of those biochemicals by way of explaining that we as people do things that are better or worse for our societies, and thus through evolution those things that are good for us as a culture become things that we as people cherish in a very physiochemical way. For example, lovemaking. There's a very real physical component of joy to lovemaking that's chemical. And the reason that's most likely there, I believe, this is just me, is because of a sense of evolution. It is good for us to mate, and so our bodies evolved a very real reason for us to do so in a physiochemical sense.
Good. But I personally am convinced that there is a lot more, hopefully, to a kiss than the approach of two pairs of lips with a reciprocal transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes.
I can certainly understand the romantic implications of that, and I think that's a philosophical notion, most certainly. But do you agree that it's entirely possible that what I'm saying is true, and a reasonable explanation for the feelings that we have as people?
I am convinced that we have physical bodies, and that we had better do good science and good medicine to sustain life, to find a cure for diabetes. I celebrate the Hispanic student group raising money to fight diabetes. But I am convinced that when you have handed in the biochemical description of the human being, you have not told the whole story. There still is conscience that ties us into real values of justice. There still is the human ability to love that is coupled with a free will. I don't have to love. I don't have to forgive. I can cut my enemy off at the knees, or I can forgive my enemy. I don't have to do either.
I have a question then philosophically. Do you feel that as a Christian, that explanation of those feelings is completely sufficient?
What explanation?
Do you think that idea of love and hate as a metaphysical construction is a completely sufficient thing? My asking, the reason I ask, is because if it is completely sufficient, then why do we need to explore it scientifically?
Because like it or not, we have physical bodies that are very real, and science is a tremendously valuable study of our physical bodies and our physical universe, and that is excellent. And if you will study the growth of modern science, you will notice that it grew up in Christian cultures, in Christian societies, where there's a belief that God has created in an orderly way, God has given us rational minds, and by doing good science, we can think God's thoughts after Him. So that's very, very important. But a Christian worldview also informs you that there is more to truth and more to knowledge than just scientific knowledge.
Is it also fair to say then, and I don't mean to misquote you in any way, that science also was very well held and respected in Muslim cultures and Chinese cultures?
Yes, but the growth of modern science occurred in Christian cultures.
Well,
that's where it started, which is a strong reprimand to anybody who thinks that the Bible contradicts science. No, the Bible gives you the basis of the scientific endeavor, which is creation is real, your rational mind is a gift from God, exercise your rational mind in a responsible way, and do good science.
Do you mean do you mean in essence that the foundations of the scientific method was laid in Western,
Modern science grew up in the West, Christian West.
Okay.
It's not a statement about any other culture, it's simply a statement for those of you who think that the Bible contradicts science or that goes against science. That is totally false. Historically, it's the Christian West where modern science began.
Would you agree that the origins of democracy and indeed most of the scientific method comes then from ancient Greece? a paganist society?
Sure that other cultures have done science and other cultures have done government, but let's just get one thing straight. Followers of Christ have been at the forefront of the development of modern science. Johann Kepler, the father of modern astronomy, as he peered out into the stars at night, exclaimed, "Oh God, I'm thinking your thoughts after you." So there's no contradiction between hard science and the Bible.
Upon what foundation, and I only seek to understand more, upon what foundation do you make the claim that modern science is based primarily in Western Christian civilization?
It began in Western civilization. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton. Modern science began in Western Europe, in the United States.
People that you're citing studied Muslim astronomers.
They did. Muslim astronomers were far more advanced than those people at the time.
Oh,
Muslim
great,
astronomers invented
wonderful.
the telescope before Galileo.
Excellent. But modern science, I think, historically grew up in the West.
I think it's perhaps just a little unreasonable to make the claim that science grew up primarily in the Christian West.
I never said that. I said modern science.
Did I not just say modern science?
No, you said science.
Oh, I apologize. You think, okay, modern science grew up primarily in the Christian West. Do you think that has mostly to do with matters of theology?
In the dialogue above, the two speakers argue that without God, all moral standards reduce to personal or cultural relativism, and I find this argument not fully correct. The conversation begins with a pressure test that is emotionally charged and morally extreme. The discussion uses atrocities, Hitler, genocide, infanticide, eugenics, as a way to expose what each worldview can and cannot justify. That strategy is rhetorically effective, but it can also blur important distinctions. Explaining how people reason is not the same as justifying what they do, and logical is not the same as true or good. One speaker's central move is, if there is no God, then Hitler is right for himself, and you're right for yourself. It's all relative. This is a powerful line because it sounds like it has only two options, God or chaos. But the inference is not airtight. Even without invoking God, a person can argue that moral claims are not merely personal preference and still avoid anything goes. Here are the key philosophical splits that matter. First, relativism versus realism. It's possible to reject God and still hold a form of moral realism, believing that some moral truths are objective or at least mind-independent, in the sense that they are not made true by my feelings. One can ground moral norms in reasons about human flourishing, suffering, agency, reciprocity, and the conditions that make social life possible. That doesn't automatically collapse into Hitler is right for himself. It becomes a debate about the best account of moral objectivity, not an automatic surrender. Second, the debate confuses science with scientism. It is correct to say that science, as a method, describes processes and does not by itself produce oughts from is, but it does not follow that morality becomes arbitrary. Morality may be informed by facts about harm, psychology, social stability, human development, while being justified by ethical reasoning that is not reducible to lab measurements. The crucial point is, science can inform moral judgment without being the source of moral authority. That middle position exists. Third, invoking Hitler as logical can be misleading. A person can build an internally consistent chain of reasoning from false premises. If your premise is Jews are subhuman, you can derive monstrous conclusions logically. But what matters is not whether a chain is consistent. What matters is whether the premises are warranted. Calling evil logical risks, giving it an aura of intellectual legitimacy it does not deserve. Better to say, he reasoned, but he reasoned from lies and hatred. Coherence is not truth. Fourth, consider the Eskimo example. It raises cultural anthropology and moral judgment. The danger on one side is arrogant moral imperialism. The danger on the other side is moral paralysis, pretending we can't condemn anything because culture. A sharper approach is to distinguish surface practices from core moral principles. Cultures vary, but principles like protection of the vulnerable, avoidance of needless harm, and honesty about persons as persons can be argued for across cultures. You can critique harmful acts while still being humble about context. So I disagree with the claim that without God, morality necessarily becomes relative in the sense of anything is justified for the agent. That is too quick. However, the theistic critique does land a real challenge. Non-theistic moral theories must explain why moral obligations have binding force beyond preference. They can answer, but they must answer. They cannot simply say, "we feel it," because feelings vary. They must show why the reasons are compelling. The best version of the debate at this stage is not God or Hitler. It's this. If you claim objective moral wrongs exist, like genocide, what is the best explanation of that objectivity? Is it grounded in God, or in rational obligations tied to persons, or in something else? And can your account explain why we should obey moral truth even when it costs us? That is where the debate becomes intellectually honest. The discussion then pivots to George Bernard Shaw's disillusionment with faith in science, and to the distinction between science and ethics. Here, the speaker is strongest when he insists, science is not an ethic. That is a needed correction in an age where people often smuggle moral authority into scientific language. But we should be equally careful not to swing into the opposite extreme, treating science as ethically irrelevant. The right balance looks like this. Science cannot tell you what is good, but it can tell you what is real about the consequences of actions. Ethics needs facts. When you decide whether a policy harms children, or whether a practice increases suffering, or whether addiction destroys agency, you are using empirical reality. So while science cannot generate moral values from nothing, it can and must play a role in responsible moral deliberation. Next, the dialogue moves into chemistry, endorphins, sexuality, and the attempt to explain love as biochemistry plus evolution. The Christian speaker replies with a memorable line about a kiss being more than carbon dioxide and microbes. That's rhetorically sharp, and it points toward a genuine philosophical issue: reductionism. Here's the core. Even if love has biochemical correlates, it does not follow that love is nothing but biochemistry. Correlation is not identity. Explanation at one level does not erase meaning at another level. You can explain a symphony in terms of vibrating air molecules, but that doesn't capture melody, beauty, intention, and the experience of listening. Likewise, you can describe neural activity during forgiveness, but that does not exhaust what forgiveness is: a decision, a commitment, a moral act that changes relationships. So the skeptic is right to say, feelings have physical mechanisms, but the Christian is right to insist, mechanisms do not settle the question of meaning, normativity, and responsibility. Then comes the deeper hinge: conscience and moral obligation. The Christian speaker argues that conscience ties us to intangible values, like justice, and that these values require a divine foundation to be real. This is the classic moral argument. Even if one does not accept it, one should admit its strength. It is not saying people have feelings. It is saying we experience moral claims as binding. You ought not do this. And that ought is not the sort of thing chemistry measures. However, we must also test the argument carefully. The skeptic responds with a social account. Morals exist as norms, laws, shared expectations. If nobody believed murder was evil, society would collapse. This is a functional explanation. It helps explain how moral systems operate, but it does not yet explain why they are true or right. It explains enforcement. It does not explain moral authority. This is where both sides often talk past each other. The skeptic says, morality is real because we can describe it, enforce it, and it shapes behavior. The theist says that shows morality is influential, not that it is objective. If the crowd changes, does right change? A sharper framing is 1. Descriptive morality, what people believe and enforce. 2. Normative morality, what is actually right even if no one believes it. 3. Meta-ethical grounding, why normative morality has authority. The Christian speaker is pushing from 1 to 2 and demanding 3. The skeptic keeps returning to 1. If the skeptic wants to truly answer the theist, he must address 2 and 3. Why is genocide wrong even if the victors write the textbooks? Yet the theist also must avoid an overreach. Even if objective morality exists, It does not automatically prove the Christian God specifically. It may point toward a moral source, but further steps are needed. So the strongest, fairest conclusion is, the skeptic has a plausible account of moral development and enforcement, but it risks collapsing into what society approves. The theist has a powerful argument that some moral truths feel binding beyond society, but it must clarify why God is the necessary and not merely a convenient explanation. At the end of this first major section, what stands out is not that one side wins, but that the debate reveals the real battlefield, whether moral obligation is merely constructed or truly discovered, and what kind of reality must exist for evil to be more than a label.